Trudi, I do health coaching, and there's dogma. There are nutritional sort of non-facts that have been ingrained in people's head for decades, and it's very difficult to break through that dogma. What I find the toughest challenges for me are the fear of fat, that fat will clog up your arteries and fat will make you fat. And that's one that I find difficult to break through. And we're not necessarily saying everyone needs to be on a very high fat diet, but being fearful of fat is an extreme which is not based on science. The second one I found challenging is a fear of protein, which I know you're passionate about. You've done presentations on protein. People are afraid of protein mainly because of kidney disease. And the third one, of course, is carbohydrates, because people believe we have to have carbohydrates. We need to put glucose into our bodies so we can function better. Now, I'm gonna give you the stage, put the screen on you, Trudi, so you can cover protein, fats, and carbs, and what they are they essential? Should we be afraid of any of them? And any other insights you have on those? I'd appreciate that.
Brilliant. So I start first of all with carbohydrate, because carbohydrate is not an essential nutrient. An essential nutrient is one that the body cannot make. And if we don't eat carbohydrate, then the body can make it. So how this happens is through a process called gluconeogenesis. And it happens in the liver. And for every 100 grams of protein we eat, we can convert the amino acids, the building blocks of the protein, we can break those down and convert it into 56 grams of glucose. And so the liver can generate between 6 grams and 25 grams of glucose per hour if it needs to do so. So we absolutely don't need to eat carbohydrate because the body can make it. People then say, oh, but the brain needs 130 grams of glucose every day for the brain to work. That's not true either, because 80% of the fuel that the brain requires, it can be provided by ketones. So what are ketones? Ketones are a byproduct, a natural byproduct that is made when we're using fat for energy. So if people are not eating the carbohydrates, then they'll use fat for fuel. And as part of that, ketones will be produced, and they are absolutely brilliant fuel for the brain because they don't cause these reactive oxygen species. So what they're called, they're like a clean fuel for the brain. And they don't cause the oxidative stress in the brain either. So there has been some work that they're good as a prevention towards dementias and Alzheimer's and things like that. Although this work is in its infancy, it's very interesting to follow that line of work. So, carbohydrate, we shouldn't be fearful of not eating it, because if we don't eat it, we can make it. But then people say, well, what about the fibre? You need the fibre to feed those, the bugs in the gut microbiota. There's a lot of fibrous foods we can eat that don't contain a lot of carbohydrate. Nuts, seeds, psyllium husk, even dark bitter chocolate is a good source of fibre. All the green leafy vegetables that people can eat as part of a keto diet give all the beneficial fibre to our gut microbiota. but also the full fat milk and dairy products as well. So if people have dairy in their diet, then cheeses and cream and but they break down to what we call the short chain fatty acids, which are excellent fuel for the gut microbiota, so for the gut lining and also the gut bugs as well. And so something like butyrate, which we can get from fibrous foods, but we can also get butyrate because it's a short chain fatty acid, which is in the milk and dairy products. So, there's other ways to kind of feed the gut microbiota. So that's largely what I've got to say on carbohydrate. Fats, the fear of fats, we've all heard the messages that you alluded to. Fat will make you fat, and fat will clog your arteries. So let's think, what causes us to lay down body fat? That's the hormone insulin. So when we eat carbohydrate in the main, then carbohydrate increases blood glucose levels and tells the pancreas, the beta cells in the pancreas, to release insulin. And insulin is what we call an energy storage hormone. So it allows us to lay down energy. And that can be in the form of glucose and glycogen in carbohydrate stores. But insulin also encourages to lay down fat stores as well. So we know yourself with having type 1 diabetes that probably before you were diagnosed, you probably lost an awful lot of weight, because if insulin levels are low or almost non-existent, then we can't hold on to our fat stores. And so the fat basically is broken down and people lose weight. So what does put on weight? Then it's high carbohydrate diets, so eating carbohydrates to excess leads to high insulin levels. The constant kind of cycle of high carbohydrate, high insulin leads to insulin resistance. Insulin resistance leads to poor glycemic control, which leads to even more insulin and hyperinsulinemia. So it becomes a vicious circle, and that leads to weight gain. And so if people are not consuming carbohydrates to excess, then they're not going to be laying down all those fat stores. And one thing that people don't appreciate also is that we can make fat in the body from carbohydrate. So when people eat carbohydrate to excess, then it's a process called de novo lipogenesis. De novo means new, production of new. Lipogenesis means fat. So if people are eating carbohydrate above their personal carb threshold, then their liver is going to convert that carbohydrate initially to glycogen, but then the carbohydrate storage, the glycogen will get full. And when that is full, then the extra glucose and fructose will get converted to triglycerides. And then that can lead to dyslipidemia, so the blood cholesterol, blood lipids, blood cholesterol, LDL, HDL, all getting out of sync and increasing risk of cardiovascular disease. So the fact that people think, well, fat will clog my arteries is also a huge myth, because when we eat fat, it goes from the gut into the lymphatic system where it's delivered to the fat stores. It doesn't actually directly go into the arteries. And so we found through delivering self-management education, once people understand those key components about what happens to fat when you eat it, they no longer got that fear of fat. But also we do need to give the message that if people are wanting to lose weight, then they don't want to take in too much dietary fat, because they want to use some of their stored fat for energy, so then they will lose weight. So when we say that a low carbohydrate is a higher fat diet, Some of that fat can be provided from people's fat stores, and it doesn't necessarily have to be dietary fat that they're eating. So I think that is also a really key point to pass on. So when people are wanting to lose weight, but they're adding loads of cream or butter to their foods, that can actually slow down or prevent the weight loss. So you need to be sensible about it at the same time. And then protein. You want me to go on about protein now?
Yes, please.
Yep. So protein is probably one of the most important essential macronutrients, because protein has many, many beneficial factors. One, it increases satiety, so it makes us feel fuller for longer. It takes longer to break down, it stays in our gut for longer. And so we know that if we have a higher protein diet, we feel full for longer and less likely to snack between meals. But also the protein, as we get older, we tend to lose some of our muscle mass. And when we lose muscle mass, our basal metabolic rate, the amount of calories we burn every day, slows down. And when we lose muscle mass, it also makes people more prone to falls. And that's the greatest cause of death in older people, is the falls. So having sufficient protein is absolutely essential. Now, there's 20 amino acids, and 9 of those are essential. So we have to eat protein to get those 9 essential amino acids. 6 other amino acids are what we call conditionally essential, which means that the body can make them unless the body is under stress of illness or other things, and then they become essential. And then there's some other amino acids that we can make in the body. But there's more research being done in recent years about what we call protein leverage. And what protein leverage is that as human beings, we'll carry on eating until we've met our protein requirements for the day. And so a lot of the ultra-processed food that's around nowadays that people are eating is very, very protein poor. It doesn't give enough protein. So people might have refined breakfast cereals, which is a real poor source of protein. And maybe you're then hungry 1 hour afterwards and snack throughout the morning and have a sandwich for lunch, which again may not be a good source of protein included in that sandwich, and then snack throughout the afternoon, and may find, we call it the werewolf syndrome, where people snack constantly throughout the evening because they just feel like they're hungry. That's very likely that they've not met their protein requirement for the day, so their body is crying out for protein. So we found that if people have at least 30 grams of protein at each meal, at least 30 grams, they're less likely to snack between meals, and not snacking between meals really help their insulin levels to drop. Once their insulin levels drop, they can start using the fat stored in their body for energy. So then they feel less hungry because their body is still being fed, but it's being fed by their fat stores rather than them eating the ultra-processed food. So we found when people are wanting to lose weight and improve their glycemic control, eating more protein is a plus. And also I know that being vegan or vegetarian is quite fashionable at the moment, but it's more difficult for people to get all the essential amino acids with a plant-based diet. It is, they do need to take supplements for things like B12, and they do have to be much more planned in making sure that they mix different sources of plant protein to get all their essential amino acids, and need to be careful that they don't overconsume on carbohydrates and fats to be able to do that. So it needs to be much more of a considered diet if people want to meet all their protein requirements being on solely a plant-based diet. It's much easier if people incorporate animal-based, even if it's just cheese and eggs, if they're vegetarian, it's much easier for them to meet all of their essential amino acids if they have some of the animal-based products in their diet.
Protein and kidney disease.
Right, yes. So there was a Cochrane systematic review that has shown that having a low protein diet does not prevent the decline in renal function. So that was a really interesting kind of, when we talk about a systematic review, we talk about where all the data has been reviewed and put together to get a kind of, evidence-based summary. And then there's also been single studies, some done by Dr. David Unwin, who is the GP in Southport. And what they have shown when people have evaluated renal health or kidney health in people going on a low carbohydrate diet, they found that actually renal function can improve. It doesn't deteriorate. So when we measure renal function, we look at the EGFR and the ACR, and we can see that often, kidney function improves. And what a study that was done in the 1990s called the UKPDS, that showed that the things that actually reduced kidney function and damaged the kidneys was raised blood glucose levels and raised blood pressure levels. So hyperglycemia, which is raised blood glucose, and hypertension, which is raised blood pressure, had much more detrimental impact on the kidneys than eating protein in the diet. And there has been studies that have compared, in people, healthy individuals and people with type 2 diabetes, people who've had higher protein diet compared to a low protein diet, and they've seen no detrimental impact of individuals having a higher protein diet. And the conclusions have been from these studies that given the benefits that higher protein can give individuals for feelings of fullness and preventing the lean muscle mass wastage, and also preventing the hip fractures and bone mass density. So giving about all the advantages from having more protein, it doesn't justify telling people that they should eat less protein at all. The protein message should be loud and clear. Base your meals on protein and veggies.
That was a wonderful overview of the macronutrients. Thank you for that. I appreciated that. It's interesting when you mentioned the theory. I don't know if it is sort of a study or a clinical study, but the theory that people tend to eat and eat and eat until they meet their protein requirement for the day, but without realizing that that's what they're seeking. It's I find that interesting because I've heard it from many others as well. And what's fascinating is that people aren't necessarily craving protein, so they don't necessarily realize that it is the protein that their body is seeking. So they keep eating more carbohydrates and then they're hungry again because they haven't reached their protein requirement. Isn't that fascinating?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, protein leverage has been proven. So people, if they have more protein, they eat less calories. If they have less protein, they eat more calories. That's been proven. The hypothesis, or what we call the protein leverage hypothesis, is that is driving the obesity pandemic. So the hypothesis is that this protein leverage is driving the obesity pandemic. And from all the reading I've done, I think, that there really is a case for that.